Hello and welcome to a new episode today. I'm Niels Eichhorn, your host here at the War of Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. And today I'm joined by, I guess, my new partner in crime for the podcast world. Hopefully, I will have him on a few more times, which is Andy Hook from the Poitiers region of France. So we got two Europeans on today. He is an American Studies PhD student at the Université of Nanterre
That's it.
in Paris, France. And today we're bringing back, as we announced a few weeks ago, Ben Jenkins from University, gets this one right this time, University of Laverne. And we're going to talk about an article that Ben published recently in the Public Historian. And just as sort of a interesting reminder, I guess, for everyone, we're going to talk about digital history today. Maybe we remember back to Earl Hess when he published The Internet and Civil War Studies in September 2019 and Civil War History, which caused quite some outrage among scholars. So that might actually come up today as well. We're having a much better topic. So Ben's article is entitled Recasting Uncle Billy. Are Sherman Posting, Digital History, and the Meaning of the American Civil War in the 20th Century in the Public Historian, published in February 2024. So, Ben, welcome back. Great pleasure to have you again. How do you feel with two Europeans on the other side today?
I feel like I'm waiting for the punchline of a joke. Two European scholars and an American walk into a bar. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it's a pleasure to be back with you here today, Niels and Andy. I really appreciate this invitation to come talk about what I think will be hopefully an interesting and eye-opening piece of research for a lot of people. But it's my absolute pleasure to be here with two folks in Europe. I mean, it's just amazing that we can do this thanks to the miracle that is Zoom.
Austria, France, and California. I mean, it's amazing.
Exactly,
Hmm.
Well, there's a punchline for you.
for sure.
One of us has terrible food, one of us has good food, and one of us has mediocre food. And our
I
listeners
think
can pick which one it is.
I think I know where you're coming from. I think I know who's who, but okay.
I'm not a fan of frog legs, so everyone can pick their own. um, so let's start, Ben. How did like we just talked recently about your book on citrus planting in California, and then you like literally immediately have another piece coming out with the Civil War and something totally different. So how did you get interested in Sherman?
I guess, well, the Civil War was really my entry point to American history, which I think is true for a lot of folks who end up studying that subject. I just have always been fascinated by this huge clash, that involves pretty much every segment of American society, North, South, white, immigrant, native born, indigenous, male, female. And so I just have always had that interest in the Civil War. I think that really is what turned me into a historian originally. I'll never forget though that one of the first meetings I went to in grad school was like an orientation session where they had a couple of faculty members at my alma mater, UC Riverside, sit down all the new graduate students and say, "Okay, what's your potential research area? What's your research area? What's your research area?" And at the end, they're like, "Okay, nobody's doing the Civil War." Which is good because that's already been written about so much that no one has anything new to say about it. And so, I mean, obviously that's not true, right? There's cutting edge scholarship coming out every year. But I guess this article was sort of my way of saying, well, darn it, I do want to have some sort of interaction with the topic that got me interested in history to begin with. And the fact that there's a like-minded community of people on Reddit who sort of, I'm going to put my own political views out there, share a lot of what I feel about the South and
Mm-hmm.
the role of the Confederacy in America's national discourse today really got me to think about how digital publics are still tapping into this rhetoric of history, trying to make it relevant to their
Mm-hmm.
experiences, and trying to make it something that matters for 21st century politics. Um, not to get too far from the actual article itself, but I actually have the homepage of Sherman Posting open right now. In the very top piece, if I can share it here, actually, always better to show than to tell, right? Is this article showing, a bunch of people in Texas standing with Trump. The silent majority stands with Trump, this meme says. And underneath them is a picture of William Tecumseh Sherman, red background, and he's saying, "You look flammable." Obviously calling to mind stuff like the burning of Atlanta or the march to the sea. So just the fact that people still see the Civil War as something that is relevant to what America is, its national identity in 2024, really fascinated me. And so I wanted to try to sort of pull out, what does this mean for digital history? What does this mean for us as scholars? What does this mean for having a public or set of publics that is hopefully informed by historical discourse?
No, Andy.
Um, that's really fascinating. And I think for Niels, it's the same thing, that we both got into history. And for me, it's been my entire life, and it's with the Civil War. That was my main thing too, from the very beginning. But this has really opened my eyes actually to the I guess importance of bringing that history into today's discourse, making it palatable for, and making it bridging the gap, as you say, between scholarly, what's been written, and there's no wouldn't need to write any more about the Civil War because it's already been written about, to this, making it absolutely contemporary. I mean, everything is so linked to. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, I guess the question there is, could we like, people sometimes are like, oh, I don't like books because it's so boring to read. Like, could we perceive of like something like Reddit or like social media and stuff, like maybe as sort of a sexy new way of doing history?
I think we have to. I teach classes on public history at the University of Laverne, and I always tell my students, every time you tweet, every time you put out a story on Instagram or a post on Facebook, you're leaving behind a trace of yourself. You're creating a primary source that scholars 50 or 100 years from now will use to understand the human experience in 2024. So I think that the sources that folks are using to engage with the world around them, these are absolutely going to be primary sources in the future. And we really have to take that seriously. We have to consider the fact that, a lot of people these days are not going to leave behind a written record, but they're going to leave behind a very rich digital trail. And so I really try to encourage my students to think, how is this going to communicate your history? How are you sort of putting together an archive of the self whenever you go on to Twitter and retweet something that Elon Musk says, and whether you agree with or disagree with that? Most of them disagree with it, for what it's worth, but I digress. So I think, the digital is just where we are. Like when I was in grad school, it was very popular to say, oh, digital is the future. Digital is what people are going to be doing in 5 or 10 years. That future has arrived. This is how people primarily communicate today. And so if we neglect that, and if we neglect the digital communities and the sort of messages that those communities are creating, then I don't think we're doing our job as scholars, especially me being a public historian, that we're not following what the public's doing.
And I'm just going to throw it out for all three of us to kind of think about and maybe come up with an answer. Like, what is digital history?
That's it.
Right? Like, what is it? I mean, I took a course on it, and I'm not sure I have a good answer. Go ahead.
How about this? I received my master's in 2004, and I got back into my PhD, starting my PhD 12 or 13 years later, and everything changed. And so now people are talking about digital history and digital humanities. It came out of nowhere for me.
Yeah.
I mean, completely out of nowhere. So for me, this is a really good explanation, this article, because it dives in and it digs in and it goes back to talking about Web 2. Because people don't talk about Web 2, or people don't talk about Web 1 anyway.
Exactly. Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, and I completely agree with you, Andy, that the digital landscape has changed completely. Back in 2005, I think it was, two scholars, Daniel Cohen and I think it was David Thalen, wrote a fantastic book on digital history where they sort of overviewed what's the history of the internet, how have scholars used it to communicate with each other, how have scholars used it to like put primary sources on the web, whether that's big stuff like Library of Congress or more local projects like college libraries.
Mhm.
And so for them, and when this book was published in 2005, digital history is very much something that scholars did, put online, and the public would then absorb. Whereas
Mhm.
with Web 2.0 moving forward, it's very much participatory, right? Like the audience, and I use audience in quotation marks here, is doing just as much of the heavy lifting. In many
Mhm.
cases, a lot of these Civil War buffs on Sherman posting will know obscure details about certain battles that I certainly don't know a whole lot about since they've done a lot of the reading. But the point is that they're producing content and ideas. They're not
Mhm.
just passive absorbers of information. They're producing even without us as scholarly mediators. So maybe the sort of frightening thing that we have to do is re-envision what our role here is
Mhm.
in an odd with a group of users that's already very historically informed and literate. I suppose we could focus on, skills teaching and things like that, but I feel like they have as much to teach us about what the past means in the 21st century as we have to teach them.
Whose job is it to curate the the study of history
Yes, that's exactly
in
the
digitalized?
question. Yeah, that's one of the
Mhm.
main things that I really wanted people to take away from this piece, right? Is that it's a participatory, collaborative endeavor. This isn't to dismiss scholars entirely, because I think that there are still certain things that we can and do that sort of set us apart from non-scholars. We engage with primary sources in ways that maybe other people don't. We spend our entire careers, right, flying around to different archives to do just that. Um, but we are just sort of one node in the digital universe now. And we're a different node for sure, but we have to pay as much attention to the other content producers.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of a good point that you're raising when it comes to digital history, right? Of like, and the memes and the Reddit forum with Sherman, and it's sort of like you, it historians have a hard time surrendering control, I feel like. That you
Oh,
kind of
yes.
want that you have studied it for so many years. You wrote a book about it, and now comes along this untrained person that takes the knowledge and creates something completely different with it that may or may not be totally true to the historic accuracy, right? Like I think when we think about it, we saw that a lot with the 1619 project too, where it's like all these dinosaurs in the profession who all of a sudden were up in arms. How dare a New York Times reporter completely alter the narrative of the United States?
You're absolutely right. Historians are sort of loath to admit the fact that really anybody with the ability to read and write and with some form of critical engagement can do history, can write about the
Mhm.
past. I mean, we have so many journalists pumping out books about every historical topic every year, right? Like,
Mhm.
Right.
we're not like physicists or doctors where you really have to be an exclusive club and you can't let outsiders in. But yeah, I think a lot of historians I found are very loath to sort of like, well, I've studied this topic for 50 or 60 years. I've been from every archive from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to College Park, Maryland, where the National Archives is based. So it's really time to start thinking about what can the public do that we can't.
Well, but then that also raises the question, and this is one of the things that I really enjoyed here, is you talk about digital history, of course, and you talk about popular history and public history. So there's a kind of melding of all three: popular, public, and scholarly history that all blend together perfectly into this melding of ideas and nuance into the digital history that you're talking about.
It's a great point, Andy. I think we, as historians, so often get locked up in sort of what are our divisions, right? Like,
Mhm.
what is our specific area? Like, I am an Americanist, so I don't really consider East Asia, or I don't really consider what's
Mhm.
going on in Europe in the 19th or 20th centuries. Whereas the reality is, the historical people that we're studying very much did so. I mean, a lot of to come back to my first book about railroads in California, a lot of these guys were very interested in capturing East Asian trade, and they were reliant on capital that was flowing in from particularly London, but also continental Europe as well. So I think that sort of disciplinary division and its artificiality is something that you've pretty successfully applied, Andy, to popular, public, and scholarly history. Maybe the disciplinary boundaries there are a little bit more malleable now that we occupy this digital universe and can share information much more effectively than we would have been able to do even 25 years ago.
Well, and then not just, well, there's also sparking new debate and germinating new ideas and initiating new
Yeah.
topics and new avenues of understanding of the past in a different context, contemporary context, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of my favorite things about this subject is that it's constantly evolving. People are constantly producing new ideas, new sources, new memes. And I remember when I was originally writing this piece in 2022, the Supreme Court was looking at potentially overturning abortion. And so, not to get too political into that and not to take a stance one way or another, but one of the first things that people did on Sherman Posting was to be like, oh, this activist Supreme Court is curtailing women's civil liberties in the 2020s. Let's compare that to how Roger Taney handed down the Dred Scott decision back in the 1850s and how he essentially stripped, civil rights away from millions of people, free or enslaved, in the United
Mhm.
States. And so to make that comparison to like somebody literally made a meme showing Roger Taney and Samuel Alito next to each other, being like, "Hey, look at these two activist judges who are stripping away civil rights." It's just amazing to me. I think that's something that historians, if they wanted to do that, they'd have to write an op-ed into a professional journal or into a trade magazine doing
Mhm.
that. Whereas on Reddit, all you can do is slap together two images, come up with a pithy caption, and boom, you've made a meme and you've sparked discourse that would have taken weeks or months for a scholar to be able to accomplish just because of the boundaries of peer review and the timing of publication. So the speed at which the internet moves and how it's able to create those new contexts suggests an agility that some of these
Mhm.
older formats just weren't capable of matching.
Yeah, and I was just thinking when you said that too, it's sort of like the like today's speed, knowledge interest is just I want something now. I don't want it in 2 months. It needs to be there. And like, yeah, the profession sometimes with the old way of moving is too slow. I mean, we have things that, I mean, there's been recently some debates about some of the comments that one of the editors made, like made by history at the time at Time magazine these days, or some of the blogs that are out there. But I feel like it's an it's a scary world in part because you have to be on the ball, you have to move fast. There's so many people wanting to share it. But then let me put it this way. Do we kind of feel that sometimes that could lead into like bad comparisons too?
I think that's absolutely possible. Yes, that people will reach the wrong sort of conclusions or act in ways that are maybe potentially harmful.
Hmm.
I this whole case study that I centered the article around Sherman posting, I think is pretty activist. They're very concerned with civil rights, with sort of promoting
Hmm.
a shared national identity. But if you were to go to other corners of the internet, even other communities on Reddit, you would see
Hmm.
people sort of taking history and using it divisively.
Hmm.
One of the case studies that I like to point to is in November of 2016, just going into December as well. Donald Trump had just won election to the presidency of the United States, and he was toying around with this idea of what he called a Muslim ban, of forbidding people from Muslim
Hmm.
nations from coming into the United States. And as justification for this, he said, oh, there's historical precedent because in the 1940s, the government of the United States authorized the military to lock up all Americans of Japanese ancestry. So he's pointing to this historical comparison, right, as a
Hmm.
means to deprive civil liberty, to close the borders. And I thought, what? This is a monstrously creative way to use the past in the present. I mean, he is relying on historical um, precedent, right? But I think in a way that most of us would probably be wagging our fingers out and saying, that's not really acceptable. That's not the kind of past that you should be looking at to justify your political agenda in the 21st century. And certainly corners of the internet are like that as well. They'll look at, justifications for slaveholding as, oh, we could recycle these arguments into why certain segments of American society are still kept down today. I could go on endlessly about this, but yes, certainly there are ways in which people can pervert the past, can
Mm.
create sort of divisions and segregations that are very harmful to our discourse in the present and our hopefully shared collective identity. They're more interested in creating division than they are in building bridges.
Are there any lost cause Reddits?
Yes, yes, there
Okay.
are. There's one called
From your
Southern
reaction, I
Liberty.
kind of sense there's a lot of them.
Well, I wouldn't say that there's a lot of like lost cause subreddits per se. There's just a lot of reactionary communities that sort
Okay.
of will tap into lost cause rhetoric.
Mm.
And certainly the biggest one is Southern Liberty. You really get pretty much everything you need to know about the community from its name, right? Like they want
Yeah.
very much to sort of have that separatist notion that the Southerners tried and failed to implement back in the 1860s. So it's the rhetoric of lost causism, of secession is not dead. I mean, when you've got politicians out there like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying there needs to be a national divorce between red and blue states, I think studying the Civil War has
Hmm.
never been as relevant as it
Yeah,
is today.
absolutely vital.
Yeah. Totally. Um, Andrew, bringing you back into the picture, like, because since we have, like, I'm still too fresh on the European continent, I'm not gonna make much comment, but how is it in France? Because in the US, you have sort of a very, you have sort of some of the ivory tower scholars, peoples that kind of are like, ooh, I don't engage the public, even though some of my books will be read by the public. You have these very public focused academics and journalists that write for it. You have like the whole social media, Reddit realm out there that kind of produces stuff in various forms. How is it in France? Is like are trained historians much more active in the public view, or are they kind of hiding
Yeah,
away at the Sorbonne?
no, no, no. I mean, there are people like that, and they're I find them hard to deal with. But no, there's a lot more interaction between a little more interviews, television, newspapers like Le Monde. Instead of going to a someone from the so-called ivory tower, they will go find a maître de conférence somewhere, so an assistant or associate professor, and see what they have to say on current events. And you get a wide range of interaction, and it's really it's a relief actually, um, to know that there are people. I mean, and it's not like in France. I don't know how it is in Austria or Germany for that matter, but in France, there are a lot of people who are in, say, my position. I'm a tenured middle school teacher, and I'm doing my PhD, and I'm not going to teach in university setting because I don't enjoy teaching
Right.
to teaching adults. And so there are actually a lot of PhDs who are non-university faculty, and so they have a lot more freedom to publish more trade type books,
Wow.
to have blogs and podcasts and all sorts of things. And one thing I have noticed in France, a lot more in France, there's a lot more of this in France than there is in the English speaking world, is there seem to be a lot more digital uh, digital reviews and digital and journals um, that are online and open access,
Mm.
which gets your stuff out there immediately. There's no turnaround.
Right.
And so whenever there's, say, a symposium or a conference, there's often immediate turnaround within a few months of publication of papers, said papers on a on a digital journal website
Mm.
for a personal organization, for a professional organization or something like that. So
Mm.
it's actually really open, and I think a lot freer
Mm.
while still being peer reviewed.
Right.
But then there's
Right.
also, like Ben, like you're saying, there's a lot of a lot of online discourse as well. Now, there's a lot of racism and stuff in France too. And you especially see that, well, I see it especially on some on Twitter, which X, I'm not going to call it X, or Facebook, which, yeah. Anyway,
No,
hope that answers your question.
no, I kind of was kind of sensing like uh, I will say that like looking at some of the things in Austria, I don't watch TV. I don't have a TV.
Better
But
off.
yeah, I know. I know. But I kind of looking at some of the kind of taking public history more into sort of the built environment side. I very often look at some of the things going on. I feel very sad because it's sort of like there was a historic building here and it just got torn down because of traffic needs or because of like, the war happened and we didn't rebuild this, or like, oh, I need to there's this beautiful historic neighborhood behind me, or like where I sit behind me. It's actually a few minute walk, but like kind of like a bit of a suburban environment, like a lot of houses that looks the same, but they don't look the same anymore because people have like added something here or like built something out there, up the roof a little bit, and it sort of destroyed the character of it. I get why they did it, but it's sort of I kind of get a bit of a feel that there isn't as much valuing of history as sort of perceived, oh, it's boring, it's not important anymore. So that's what I found really refreshing with Ben's piece, that there is this very strong communities there in the US at least that looks at that picked a Civil War general and said, this is what we're going to discuss and use to talk about various contemporary political issues.
It's the degree to which history has sort of been politicized in the United States, to which it is at the front and center of our public culture, is astonishing. I mean, you brought up the 1619 project, for instance, right? Like that's obviously
Mm-hmm.
such a huge point of contention to a lot of older established scholars who have made their name sort of coming to grips with a certain view of the American Revolution that's now being challenged. You've got people on the floor of Congress, again, calling for either a national divorce or pointing to history as like an example of, oh, no, we need to actually come together and be more progressive minded.
Mm-hmm.
But just the fact that the past is so contested in the United States, and of course, to say nothing of the biggest, most relevant debate, right, which is what do we do with our Confederate monuments and memorials? Do those even have a place in public settings? It's just, it's almost heartening to see that at least Americans care about history. At least they're trying to make it relevant to their daily lives. And in the case of Sherman posting, I think they're doing that in a really productive way, right? To
Mm-hmm.
say, this is who we are, civil rights, union forever, and not subverting the national government, not trying to promote racism. That's really sort of the raison d'etre for this community. And I'm especially sort of shocked at how they've made Sherman their poster boy for this, given how vocally racist he was against African Americans, free and enslaved, as well as indigenous peoples. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that, to their credit, Sherman Posting is reckoned with. They said, yeah, he's racist. We realize that we have an imperfect idol, but sort of there were no major forward progressive thinkers in the 19th century, right? I guess we could look at maybe a handful of reformers who wanted to actually help indigenous communities, but the fact that they've, like, as I've touted with the article title here, recast Sherman to meet what their needs are in
Mm-hmm.
2024 impresses me, gives me hope that history is something that people care about and will continue to find relevance in the future.
Now, I'm going to ask it. Why do you know why they picked Sherman? Like, I mean, why not Grant? Why not like you want a lightning rod, Phil Sheridan?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
Sure.
George Armstrong
absolutely.
Custer. Like,
Yeah,
like,
well, Custer was a loser, I guess, so that's one thing.
well, yes, he
But
was.
also, um, I think that they gravitate towards Sherman because he was, he becomes sort of the face of this total war effort, right? And scholars
Mm,
have debated whether or not it was actually total war that he practiced, because it's not like he went after civilians, right? But the fact that he, went in and was willing to raid southern plantations and to burn crops and to burn Columbia when he reached, or excuse me, Columbus, when he reached the capital of South Carolina. I was right the first time. It is Columbia.
Columbia.
Excuse
Yeah.
me.
Yep, you're right.
Just the fact that he's like, willing to go to these extreme lengths to preserve the Union, I think is sort of indicative of the fact that people today are like, well, we're under threat as well. We also need to go to
Mhm.
extreme lengths to preserve the Union from enemies foreign and domestic. And to be fair, there is a certain amount of admiration for Grant. I think that folks on Sherman posting are uh, taking part in the reevaluation that's going on of Grant's presidency, particularly his ferocious battles against the Ku Klux Klan. But Sherman, just the fact that he is a lightning rod, the fact that Southerners say, "Oh no, he's this destructive ogre," sort of allows people to come in and say, "Actually, no, he followed traditional rules of war. He may have extended those to using civilian resources, but he wasn't a war criminal in the modern sense of the word." And the fact that he sort of took the first steps towards total war in defense of what he believed was right, in defense of unionism, is an example that all of us can follow today. And maybe we just need to pluck that racism aside, acknowledge that it existed, but
Right.
obviously not perpetuate it into the 21st century.
Well, and then jumping on that, on Twitter, you see all the, well, and probably elsewhere, you see cosplayers, these CS cosplayers who are using anonymous accounts, General Lee, the General, whatever, and they always use a picture of Sherman, a meme with Sherman, and some racist direct quote from his memoirs or from a letter where he's talking about some awful racist quote as some gotcha against
Mhm.
anything that would be that they perceive as against lost cause ideology.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to see these gotcha moments for what they are. It's like, well, what are you trying to prove with this? That, oh, it's okay that Robert E. Lee owned slaves because Sherman was racist too? I mean, that's not
Right? Yeah,
the two wrongs do not make a
yeah,
right, my dear CS cosplayers.
that's it.
Or like, oh, I have black friends, therefore I'm not racist, right?
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. The tried and true friend, right? Like, oh, I
Mm,
have
Yeah.
one black friend who said something
therefore,
vaguely nice about the Confederacy, so that makes it all okay.
Yeah, no, it's it's oh goodness. On the other hand, I kind of, as you were talking, I kind of wondered like, is it maybe on purpose because Sherman is that much of a lightning rod for Southerners, right? Like he's that fire and brimstone guy. He is just this like if Southerners had to draw Sherman would probably be like some winged dragon like fire breathing creature because he is such a like even just perceived, right? We're not talking reality, it's all perception here. Perceived bad guy.
I think you're right. I think there is an element of sort of being provocative there. Lord knows that people online like to be provocative, from
Mm-hmm.
4chan to Twitter X to Reddit, right? They like to take the most offensive or negatively thought-provoking thing possible and sort of add new layers and new contexts to it. So I
Mm-hmm.
think in part this is a reclamation project, right? To sort of restore Sherman from being this destructive general, as he was known, to being actually an inadvertent, very inadvertent champion of civil rights, supporter of unionism. At the very least, he believed in the preservation of the United States, of the law and order that it represented, right? He very much was, a believer in federal authority over the states. And so he wasn't an anarchist. But yeah, I think definitely there is a tendency online to take the most extreme radical thing possible and use that for discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So, Niels, you lived in Georgia.
Yes.
So, what are your experience? What's your experience with
I
the image
actually
of
like I'm glad you asked because I kind of was thinking as Ben was talking about Sherman and sort of some of the racism and the community. So let's see which story I'm going to tell in this regard. Like obviously Sherman is a lightning rod. Like there's like I think when one of my Macon book came out, like former student of mine, John, like posted about it, and this other student who had been at Middle Georgia comes out and is like, "I hate Sherman. He destroyed my parents or my great whatever family's farm." And I was like, "Well, he probably was Confederate, so what do you expect?" Like I didn't say that, but I kind of was thinking that. But after the what was it, 2017 incident in Charlottesville, I had Trey Wellburn and goodness, what's his name? I'm sorry if he's listening in. My colleague from Fort Valley State University came up and we did a little forum of like Confederate monuments, Confederate memory. And a student of mine actually did a great job. He invited the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He invited the former mayor of Macon to this forum, who's a massive lightning rod, like community organizer. He invited, like, we had a pretty interesting group and even media in the audience. One guy reminded me sort of like if you have watched John Oliver's episode of like the um on the Confederacy, he calls one of the guys like Confederate Santa Claus. And one of the guys, he actually also said, "Oh, I'm not racist because I represented black guys in my union." Was like, like total. But point being, I had this African American community organizer in the audience who raised the point of like, look, I think Confederate monuments are bad. I think Confederate names for streets are bad. Yet, and this was an important point that I found very important that he raised, I live on Jefferson C. Davis Street in Macon. Not not the President Jefferson Davis, but the Union General who cuts a pontoon bridge to let hundreds of African American camp followers stuck. So I think that's sort of that legacy that there is this anti-Confederate aspect, but there's also a critical engagement of like, who is Sherman? That like, is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is he sort of the mix there? So point, Sherman is always bad to white Southerners, but there's also, I felt, especially with some organizers in the African American community, not an undivided loyalty to Sherman and his generals. That they were surprisingly critical. Where I even had to think for a minute of like, ooh, Jefferson C. Davis, what did he do again? Oh, yes, I totally get that. Um, so yeah, um,
Well,
there you go.
that reminds me. I just finished reading Lorene Foote's Right to
Mhm.
Retaliation, and the very last part of her book is on Sherman,
Yeah.
and kind of the limits of civilized warfare. And Ben, I noticed that you talked about you cited is it Mark Grimsley,
Yeah.
the Hard
Yeah,
Hand of
Hard Hand
Total
of
War.
War.
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
and that was the first instance that I had when I read it a while ago, of Sherman's actual military moderation. He was actually sticking pretty
Yes.
well to the plan, and he didn't
Exactly.
really go out. On the other hand, reading Lorraine Foote's book, um, yeah, his staff officers were not happy with how much the stragglers were getting away with. So there is that very very divided uh, image legacy that he's left. So yeah, you're talking
Mhm.
about a lightning rod. I mean, well, and then you see these people on Reddit who on Sherman posting who are going to find a little detail and they're going to blow it up and they're going to re-engage public discourse about it with a meme,
Yeah.
um, and bring it back into the limelight. I mean, it's a
You're
fascinating,
absolutely right.
fascinating.
No, you're right, Andy, that people will take these small historical incidents and sort of blow them up into like an entire point for dialogue, which is great. But what gets lost in many of those instances is context, right? Like,
Mhm.
Sherman lived a whole life before the war, after the war. What does his treatment of indigenous peoples, for instance, say about what his role was in American history? Some of that not being universally terrible. For instance, he was kind-ish to the Navajos in the American Southwest, as opposed to, yeah, kind-ish, exactly. But I mean, compared to how he treated other native peoples, right? I'm sure the
Uh,
Navajos might see things differently. But
oh
I think the
yes.
best source that I read for this project actually was something that I read long before I considered this, which is Sarah Ann Rubin's book on
Hmm.
Sherman's march through American memory, right? And how this is a topic that very much lives with us in the present day. It means one
Hmm.
thing in particular to Georgians, to South Carolinians, to people, who had to suffer through the various marches that Sherman did in
Hmm.
1864 and 65. So it's important to not sever that context, I think, to get so hyper focused on these tiny details in our drive to make, thought-provoking memes that we lose track of the big picture.
Mm.
And as great as it is, as easy it is to sort of slap a meme together in the course of just a few minutes, making sure that we are mindful of what's the background here, what are the outcomes, what's the
Mhm.
broader historical trajectory, doesn't get lost as we make this sort of new form of internet discourse take root.
Well, that being said, one thing you did mention, and I think this is really interesting. Yeah, the redditors might make a meme out of one tiny detail, but I found it really interesting that they were that generally speaking they're well read on current scholarship,
Very much so.
as opposed to
Yeah.
getting their news from Facebook or from YouTube.
Or is that neo-Confederate literature? What's that? The Davis trial book?
What is that?
Oh,
I'm
it's
not familiar.
like it's these two neo-Confederate lost causers who wrote a book practically putting Jefferson Davis on trial and kind of going through like what accusations they are and what if those accusations were actually real or not.
And of course they weren't, and he was
Of
not,
course not.
guilty
Yeah,
of treason. And
No,
yeah,
of course not.
yeah, yeah. So it's like it's this harebrained weird book, but it's like but yeah, it's I
no, but
think
this is,
that's
yeah, but yeah, I mean, that's exactly
yeah.
what they're up with they're on point with the scholarship. Um, but whether scholars will accept their participation, that's something else, I guess, entirely. But
The breadth of content you can see on here is pretty amazing because they'll make historiographic arguments as much as they'll make historical ones, right? Like, for instance, Woodrow Wilson is not well liked at all on this subreddit because of his, you can't even call him a neo-Confederate, right? I guess just an old school Confederate himself almost, since he was born into Civil
Mhm.
War South, right? Um, but there's definitely an appreciation for, what are the big Civil War books that are coming out,
Mhm.
whether those are scholarly in nature or popular. I know, for
Mhm.
instance, that people are very enamored of Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses S. Grant that is coming up on 7 or 8 years old now.
Mhm.
And that's a very popular read on this subreddit. But, they also look at what's coming out of the academy these days. What are new ways that scholars are thinking about the American Civil War? So they are remarkably well read about history as well as historiography. So
mm.
We need to make sure
it's
we
it's
post this video to it.
what's that?
We need to make sure that when I post the videos that or the podcast that we post that on that Reddit so they can listen to what we are talking about.
Well, but and
Yes.
it gives them legitimacy as well,
Yeah,
because I mean, who
no,
are we?
well, yeah, and but I think the other points that you kind of raised that I sort of was interesting, kind of thinking about your piece, and especially kind of like what's the focal point, right? When it comes to Sherman in Georgia, it's a burning of Atlanta, even though he really didn't burn Atlanta. Most of that is just gone with the wind kind of stuff that later on is created. But how much is somewhat the imagery that we see coming out in these memes and sort of in some people's perception there built around that sort of that image of Sherman as sort of that destructor of some southern communities rather than like the realities of like no, Hood burned Atlanta just as much as Sherman did, and Confederates burned Columbia just as much as Sherman did, like this is more than one story.
Some of the nuance and the subtlety that you'll see maybe in the comments sections, but those don't get transformed into memes
Hmm.
as much. So maybe as they listen to this podcast, Redditors will think about, oh, what new subject areas can we do? How can we dunk on
Oh.
Confederates even further in the future?
Totally right.
Well, and the little details that you mentioned. I mean, I made a note here of talking about one popular post that satirized the segregationists of Central High School in Little Rock. And you have these stubbly segregationists, um, short, bald, stubbly segregationists, who are contrasted with these uh, bearded soldiers and black students who are very with big shaggy, well-defined chins, big shaggy beards, and who epitomize masculinity. And that racists, and I quote, cannot achieve true Americanness. So the manliness the unmanliness, I guess, of the segregationists and the racists. The little, yeah, I know.
Let me pull that up because I didn't actually include that image in the article, but here it is online. And this actually draws from a
Oh,
very popular meme format. It's called Soy Jack versus Chad. Soy Jack would refer to the gentleman on the left here, the stubbly faced guy, right? It's like, oh, he can't even grow a beard, who's meant
mm,
to represent the segregationists. Whereas on the right, you have, federal armed National Guards. You've got one of the students who's going to desegregate Central High at Little Rock, and they're clearly drawn with these impressive mustaches, these pronounced strong chins, piercing eyes, as opposed to this crying neo-Confederate over here. So this is a very common meme format online, right? Where we'll turn the person that we don't like into the soy jack, who's like emasculine, childish, and we'll turn people that we agree with and that we support into the Chad, or the guy who's like seen as muscular, the epitome of this like Nordic masculinity. And there's actually a really troubled history sort of behind that meme format. And I appreciate the fact that here it's being reclaimed, right? Like they're using Chad to, a black man gets to participate in his Chadness, if you will.
mm.
So in this instance, it's sort of using what has historically been a problematic meme format and making it more productive, inclusive, and civil rights minded.
Mm.
Yeah, and see, I didn't know the image, so yeah, when I was reading this, I didn't have that in mind, and I'm glad you have the names as well of the meme characters, because occasionally, yeah, you do see the names popping up, or you see references to, well, obviously a Chad, you see the Chads, but the soy jack, I don't know if I'd ever heard or read the name, but it's
Mm.
never used in a positive way. That's definite.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of a stereotype, right? I mean, it's sort of like the 19th century political stereotypes that we might see in cartoons about government people, or heaven knows the way that the Chinese or African Americans were stereotyped in popular media back in the 19th century. Which is not to say that this meme that I just shared is inherently racist, because it's, I think, quite the opposite. But it's interesting to me that it's tapping into that shared sort of visual lexicon that people online would already have access to, and sort of assuming, okay, you have a working body of knowledge. How can we sort of modify that into a more pro civil rights, pro union form?
Yeah, I love it. It's but I kind of feel reminded was one of the things that you kind of um wrote too, that sort of the danger that lies in sort of these broad brush strokes that you're using here that potentially lose some of the nuance of a historical situation. How much is that a conversation point among this Reddit community?
I'd say it's a very deep one. Again, they're very historically, very historiographically engaged. If you go into the comments sections on these posts,
Mm,
people will bring up the most obscure stories about, here's an obscure station of the Underground Railroad and how it was still operating during the Civil War. Or here's what this exact regiment from Iowa was doing in battle at Shiloh in
mm,
1862. And it's just like the amount of historical detail that they have here is impressive. And the way that they use sort of smaller stories to suggest a larger narrative, or to be like, and here's what it all means more broadly speaking for us as pro-union, pro-American people. They never lose sight of the big picture. They are able to use the way we as historians kind of do. They're able to sort of find historical details, find primary sources, and say, here's the point, here's the argument I'm trying to make based on that. So, in their own way, even though they're using visual culture more than scholarly manuscripts,
mm.
they're kind of doing the same thing on Sherman posting that the rest of us do in writing book manuscripts or publishing articles. They're trying to use history to make a certain argument and form where we are in the present. And so at that very broad philosophical level, I just have to respect and appreciate and, dare I say, support sort of what Redditors are doing, at least on Sherman posting.
Hmm.
Well, again, it's breaking down the divisions and giving us
Exactly.
opportunity for more exchange and the initiation of new ideas
And in part, I kind of asked that too because I as weird as it is looking back now, I was one of my lectures was on like I eventually turned my U.S. survey into a public history kind of memory focus and was like, okay, it reads a textbook, figure out what happened, and then we're going to talk in class about how we remember what happened and how that differs. And of course, as a Civil War historian, I did a significant section on the Civil War memory, Reconstruction, the battlefields, and there was one meme. I'm gonna for those who are watching, gonna share that here real quick, and I will describe it for the listeners. So this was a meme. I think John Legg found it for me and shared it with me. So it's text here: the federal government feels bad about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with images of the atomic bomb cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then the second line of images and text, but never gave a second thought to Columbia, Charleston, Atlanta, Richmond, and Nashville, with 5 pictures. And then closing here, the South is ready for her apology. I think this ties really beautiful with Sherman because Atlanta and Columbia are 2 cities that he actually attacked and destroyed. I used it in my class primarily to kind of say, where's the propaganda value in this, right? Like, why did somebody build this? And I like when I first saw it, I was like, wait a minute, Charleston never got burned by the U.S. forces. That was an accidental fire in, I think it was December of 1861. Like the picture of Nashville is actually Harper's Ferry, right? It's like it's totally like yeah, Columbia is the right one. Atlanta is, I think, Richmond actually. So it's like it's totally wrong. But how much could have, when we look at memes, how much do we have to watch that as sort of like, obviously the guys on Reddit, they know what they're doing. We know what's going on. But for the casual observer, I'm kind of thinking here, like the person that's on scrolling through Reddit, all of a sudden sees this meme pop up. How important is it that like when they see something like that, somebody steps in and is like, no, 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 this is totally wrong. Like, how big is that danger?
I'd say it's enormous. We have to consider the fact that every time someone makes a meme, they do so with a political agenda. There's a very famous instance on Reddit where there was a very strong libertarian community that posted an image showing this some dilapidated rundown slum saying this is what a communist country looks like. And then there was like this nice country club looking villa captioned, "Oh, but here's a capitalist country." And then someone had to come in and comment, actually, that slum is Detroit, and the very nice looking photo that you've chosen is Cuba. So, congratulations, you've mixed up capitalism and communism and sort of their impact. So, which is not to make a point about economy, which is not to get political, but it's to show the ease with which things can be sort of slotted into categories that they don't actually belong in, where um, false information can be propagated. And as soon as this was pointed out, the guy who made the actual meme said, "Wait, really?" And he seemed like unaware of what he'd done and guilty. Like he wasn't trying to spread misinformation, but that doesn't change the fact that he did peddle falsehoods online. So we have to be really mindful of what's coming out from where. Everyone has an agenda. Is there a way that we're able to disentangle this? And if it's, John Doe's 420 online posting information and we don't necessarily know where he is, what his background is, what his political beliefs are, then it can be sort of difficult to find the agenda.
Right.
I had a follow up on that, kind of a 2-part follow up. Um, do do you know? Do we know who the members are of these groups? I mean, in terms of, are they like from the United States? Maybe, or do we know?
Primarily, they are American. I actually just saw a thread on the Sherwin posting as I was getting ready to talk to you guys this morning, where someone said, "Hey, I'm from Northern Europe. Are we welcome here as well?" And the people are like, "Oh yeah, absolutely. Anyone who has an interest in history and applying it to the present
Oh,
totally has a place in this community."
wow.
But as far as like individual identities or
So
people's
not.
backgrounds, unless they share that in a post or unless they like have a really detailed Reddit bio page, that you're not unfortunately going to have access to where they came from or what it is
Mm,
that they're trying to prove. So that's why I think it's important to really just sort of step back and look at the big picture and be like, okay, what are the patterns that we see among these memes? What's getting
mm.
votes or likes and what's getting ignored?
Yeah, and then
What
we'll.
is getting ignored?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, Andy,
No, no,
but
no, no.
I'm
Go
kind of
ahead, Neil. No,
curious.
no, no.
What is being ignored? What are they not dealing with a lot?
Well, anything that's pro South
Of course, yes.
usually will either that'll either get ignored or it'll get brought on and said, look at how wrong these people are. Look at how they want to continue to sow division and break the
Right.
United States apart and violate civil liberties just because, they had the Confederacy for 4 years.
Mm, okay.
That's the kind of stuff that gets ignored. I guess this community is also very militarily and politically focused. So
Okay.
stuff on the economic aspect of the war
Mm,
or culture and society maybe doesn't receive as much attention. It's still
okay.
there. It just
Yeah.
doesn't. It's not front and center the way pictures of Sherman leading his army on horseback are. So it's a very politically, militarily minded subreddit. And
Mm,
I sort of get that. That's how I came about
yeah.
the Civil War, right? Like reading, these grand narratives of hundreds of thousands of men going into battle against each other and, elections and the fate of nations. So that's what draws a lot of us to the Civil War to begin with. So I can't fault them for
Yeah.
focusing on that topic above others.
Well, and then kind of jumping on that, you mentioned the kind of topics that are not directly Civil War related on Sherman posting, but that promote kind of anti-Southern tropes. So, for example, mapping the existence of slavery, comparing the maps of the existence of slavery with different social issues. For example, education and poverty. It looks like covering the same zones. The areas where where there was slavery are the areas where there's more child mistreatment than in other parts of the United States. Things like that. Are those types of posts as popular as the directly Sherman related memes and posts?
It sort of, they certainly have the potential to be. I mean, it sort of just depends on what kind of mood people are in. Um, I would say that the trend here is to think broadly about sort of what's good for the union, what's historically inclusive and beneficial. It's not universally focused on Sherman. For instance, right now I'm looking at the homepage of Sherman Posting and I only see like one image of him, whereas I can see lots of images of, oh, here's the Klan and someone's flipping off a Ku Klux Klan pin. Um,
Mm,
Other civil rights related materials, questions about, how did this Civil War monument come up? So it's not universally focused on Sherman. He's not. It's not always just pithy memes, right? Like those are just sort of the entry point into what I think are actually pretty interesting, multifaceted, and deeply engaged scholarships of the Civil War. So it's not all like just stuff about the battle. It's very much focused on like civil rights and how do we perceive the Union and the Confederacy today. That's really the meme that people are going through right now, especially since that whole Texas secessionist movement came about a couple months ago. People are like, "Oh no, we tried this once, Texas. How did that work out for you back in 1861?"
Well, okay. So, sorry, Niels, I'm kind of hogging the mic here.
no, right, right.
Um, so okay, so then my second part of the question I had earlier was, um, who how visible is Sherman posting on as a subreddit? So I don't use Reddit very much. I have it on my phone. And until reading your article, I had never seen Sherman Posting. So I went to Sherman Posting and I joined it because I think it's a really interesting subreddit. It's a really interesting group. Someone, an average Reddit user, first time Reddit user, or someone who uses it occasionally, how, I guess it all depends on the algorithm, of course, but how powerful is the subreddit in terms of the site's algorithm? Is it going to pop up randomly on somebody's feed, or is it something that you would have to look through? You'd have to search for Civil War, or you'd have to search for secession, or Republicans or Trump or something in order to get to it, in order to have it pop up as one of your results.
Until recently, you probably would have had to do a pretty deep dive to find it. But there have been a couple cases where pieces of information, whether those are news articles or memes that were published to this community, get aggregated into the site's all page, which is like takes some of the most popular upcoming stuff from across Reddit. And when it appears on the front page of Reddit, sometimes this information is likely to reach communities that it wouldn't otherwise. I think also that there are a ton of communities about the past and especially about memeing history on Reddit, and they're starting to pick up on Sherman Posting. Like anything that is pro union, like, oh, Sherman Posting would love this. Or if there's any pro Confederate stuff, they'd be like, let's share it to Sherman Posting and see what those guys and gals think about it.
Hmm.
So it's not the most visible community. It only has 120,000 or so members, and you can have Reddits that are like have tens of millions of members. So in terms of scale, it's much smaller. But it's not a complete unknown.
Okay. And then I had another one. Sorry, Niels.
Go ahead.
You talked about the Texas secession movement, the Texit movement. So a question I had a long time ago, and then you brought it up again with this Texas independence thing. Over on Twitter, X, you have a lot of well, it's propaganda. You have these Russian trolls or bots. I don't know if they're trolls or if they're humans or bots who are propagating this thing. Do you have that type of interaction and that type of content creation on Reddit and in subreddits like this, or are these actual human beings producing these memes or this content for the subreddit?
You definitely there's a bot problem on Reddit as much as there is on X or on Facebook. I think on Sherman Posting, it's not as much of a problem. That stuff is pretty closely moderated, and whenever people make posts to Sherman Posting, they'll usually have like some explanatory um, caption saying this is why I posted this here, or they'll like the original posters will take part in dialogues underneath the post. So I can't say for sure that there are no bots on Sherman Posting, but certainly they would have to do it would be more difficult for them to hide just because this community does have really deep historically informed discussions, and so bots would get called out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But again, Reddit as a whole definitely has a bot problem as much as any social medium does. I mean, people most of the time it's just people creating bots to post pictures of dogs, sometimes to go foment secession like Texit and other ridiculous sort of political separatist movements, but I haven't seen too much evidence of that on Sherman Posting.
That was my question, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. It's a very prescient one. And that's
Well,
a big challenge to digital history as a whole, not just on Reddit, but like is the information that's being produced coming from an actual human being? Because we're going to reach a point in a few years now where the AI algorithms will be sophisticated enough to create their own photorealistic images, generate captions, and make falsehoods. So that's probably a discussion for another day, but something that we as historians will have to confront sooner than later.
Sooner
well, I
rather
mean,
than later.
yes, sooner
Much,
than later, because
yeah.
I recently saw, like, what was it, black samurais and black people dressed as like Nazi uniforms that were AI generated, where you kind of were like, who even falls for this? Like this is so obviously incorrect that it's like, but of course, like, right, like it's these images that we said earlier where it's like, that guy that produces this image of third world versus first world, and it's like an image from Cuba and Detroit in the complete wrong way. Like I had a guy who, like I think it was when I forget the context, but he opposed the statement I made on, I think it was Facebook, and he put a picture of like, oh, there's this Mexico is guarding its borders to Guatemala, but he uses a picture that's out there commonly used that's actually a border wall in Israel, and you're like, dude, did you even check? Like, um, like it's mind-boggling in regard to like the
It's
potential for
frustrating.
misinformation.
Yes, it's frustrating to me because we all come from what I like to call a fact-based discipline or an evidence-based discipline. We're very similar to scientists in that we have to come up with information. We have to say, this is how we acquired it. This is how we are able to verify its authenticity. We can't just make stuff up to prove a point. And those historians who have tried that in the past have, had their tenure stripped, been rejected from academia, and rightfully so. So the fact that the internet allows people to sort of create and spread misinformation in minutes, whereas it takes us months or even years to get our books or scholarly articles out, means that we're sort of at a massive disadvantage here.
Mm-hmm.
People will be susceptible to misinformation, and since their first impressions might be rooted in that mis or even disinformation,
Mm-hmm.
it'll be very hard to dislodge those first impressions from people's minds. So, unfortunately, as we move forward, we're going to, as historians, as scholars, or even just engaged members of society, we're going to have to find ways to have authenticity checks built into whatever content that we're producing.
So would that be a Web 3.0 then?
I don't know if we're at Web 3.0, if we're going to have to skip straight past to like Web 4, 5, or 10.0, because just how quickly digital technology is evolving, right? Like when I first started my job at the university where I work, VR and 3D printing were just taking off and becoming like commercial mainstream products. Whereas today it's like, oh yeah, those are both well ensconced. I won't call them old news, but now it's all about AI and computer generated art, and who knows where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years or 5 or 10 months at this rate.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. And it was AI, it's just going faster and faster. And um very big pivot here. One thing that considering so much of the memes are image based, right? It's not just text, it's images that we're using. And obviously Sherman images are easy, like he got photographed 170 years ago, so we have no issues. But what about copyright?
That's a great question. I haven't really applied it to Sherman posting because, I mean, so many of these people are doing it for nonprofit reasons, right? Like they're not
Right,
generating any sort of financial benefit from what they're doing. They're really just doing it to have fun on the internet and to, hopefully change somebody's mind to make them a little bit more
sure.
union focused. But that's really, copyright isn't something that enters into discussion a lot online. Maybe it should. Um, I'm not super, I'm an archivist and I should admit this. I'm not super current up to date on copyright law, but stuff that was, 100 and some odd years old has mostly entered the public domain. So if you
Right.
take a picture of Sharon, for instance, it's usually
You're
royalty free,
good.
tax free, especially if it's like from Library of Congress or National Archives, where it's like free for public consumption.
Mhm.
I guess we really need to be very considerate as meme makers that we're going on to Creative Commons and trying to get all of our images from there rather than
Mhm.
downloading things. But that's a broad sort of question that the internet really needs to grapple with. And how is AI going to complicate that in the future?
Well, yeah, I was thinking in terms of like how many times have students pulled something from the internet? We're like, oh, I found it on the internet, and you're like, where? Right? But it's
Google.
yeah, Google gave it to me. But it's sort of like the photographer from the AP who goes to a Trump rally and takes this photograph. Like he's not credited with, oh, this is a photograph of mine that was used for this meme. So like part of me is like, it's a meme. We're having fun. It's sort of like artistic work on some levels that comes out of it. On the other hand, as a historian, I'm kind of like, but there's somebody whose work is being used, like so I'm not sure how I'm supposed to feel about this.
Well, then I have another kind of, it made me think of something else. Um, of course, when you go to Reddit, Facebook, whatever, any social media, you need to create an account. So anything that you post then, does that
Mm,
become the copyright property of the intellectual property of the company that owns the social media company? So if, say, you take a picture of Donald Trump from an AP photographer's picture of Donald Trump at a rally, you you meme it up for Sherman Posting, you post it to Sherman Posting. Does that then become the property of Reddit?
oh,
That's a great question. I'm sure the owners of social media, for instance, the gentleman who owns X, would probably have a strong opinion about ownership of what gets posted on his website. But it's something that just hasn't been sussed out. And that
mm,
plays into this broader question that we see of authority on Sherman Posting
right,
or social media in general, which is who are the authors or creators of these pieces that we use? In many cases, they don't really care if they're credited or not. They just like, I made this
right,
thing, post it out there. If it gets some likes, great. If it makes some traction, fantastic. But they're not like trying to get profit off of it. They're not trying to make a living. It's really just a hobby for a lot of people,
cool.
and a potentially good and beneficial hobby. But they don't they also don't necessarily get heartbroken if their content is taken down or removed for copyright reasons. It's like, okay, I'll go make another one. I'll go make 5 or 10 more memes than the times that it would have taken me to write a post on X complaining about, oh, I had my subreddit content
Well,
taken down.
and this is, you're talking about the name Sherman Posting is a play on shit posting.
Right.
And I think that that's exactly what you're talking about. I mean, you can shit post just tons of stuff.
Yeah, you
Uh,
could crank out, yeah, exactly,
yeah,
tons of low effort memes. And so if some of it doesn't end up, then no harm, no foul. I'll just go make more.
and just having a good time, get as much stuff out there as you can, and yeah.
That's the key. Having a good time, making a community, doing
Yeah.
something meaningful.
Mhm.
Even if there are setbacks, I think the people on Sherman Posting would agree that they've accomplished something, that they have created a community around
Mhm,
the historicity of the American Civil War, of Sherman, and most importantly, the idea that these notions still have something important to perform in the 21st century, that these should be vital aspects of the political culture that we have
mhm,
created and hope to sustain in an increasingly fraught age. And the fact that they're able to take this digital technology that many people point to as subversive of, oh, Reddit or places like X and Facebook are being overrun by bots that are trying to undermine American democracy. We're seeing a more constructive use, I think, of
mhm.
digital technologies in a pro historical way. So
Well, as a
that's,
counterpoint, as a very vocal
yes,
counterpoint.
exactly. Yeah, a very strong one, hopefully.
Mhm.
But that's what really attracted me to this community, is that it's still taking off, and yet I think it's already accomplished something, right? It's already made a name for itself. It's already shown, here's a model that we can follow if we want to make history relevant in an age of mis or disinformation.
Which kind of raises a question like, A, do you make your students produce memes? And how do we get more historians to produce memes for this kind of stuff? Like, I, 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 I I have the feeling, but I don't like, I have no substance for this. I get the feeling that most historians kind of just dismiss memes for the most part, or kind of it's like a cute little icebreaker to start a class, but I don't think they take it very serious. So how do we get that activism going? Because we share them all the time, right? They're beautiful, they're fun, like you said. So how do we translate that into more professionals doing it?
I think we're starting to see that a little bit more. I follow a number of different historical libraries, archives, museums
Hmm.
on Instagram, for instance, as I'm sure all of us do.
Yeah.
And every now and then they'll use images from their collections to create memes. It's a
Hmm.
first step. That's not the same as it gaining widespread academic purchase in, say, manuscripts that historians are churning out, but I think it is a solid first step. I also like to, when I explain memes to my students, whenever I teach about them, position them in the much broader cosmos of American visual culture, with the political cartoons dating back to the 18th century, evolving into comic strips by the 19th and early 20th. And then the emergence of photography and film as another form of visual culture. Memes are just the latest evolution of that. Then, of course, at every step of the way, people, when those technologies were emerging, sometimes adopted them. Other segments of society were reluctant to take them on. I think we're just sort of at that initial stage with memes still, right? They've been around
Mm.
for 15-ish to 20 years. They're still an emerging idea in the grand scheme of things. So while they're popular among younger folks and on the internet, um, there's still going to be those people who sort of resist the technological change. And I don't know how to reach them other than to say maybe attrition. Maybe, as the new generation comes in and realizes the value of this, they just sort of
The old folks
kind
need to
of
die off.
or just retire even, right? Just
Well,
go live out your
Earl
golden
Hess.
years.
I mean, you
Yeah.
talked about Earl Hess earlier.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's
But that was where I was thinking, like when as we started, I was like, well, wait a minute. There was a conversation about digital history written by somebody who everyone who read the piece was like, why would you ask this person to write about digital history who has never done anything with digital history? Like it just was mind-boggling. Um, on the other hand, I was gonna say, like, I mean, you're saying 10, 15 years here. I mean, from an internet perspective, that's
a
old news
lifetime.
almost. It's a lifetime.
Exactly. It is, yeah. I mean, it depends on who you ask. Yeah, to the internet
Yeah.
people, to folks who, were barely even alive 15 years ago, they're like, oh yeah, that's ancient history. Whereas you talk to geologists, they'd be like, oh no,
Sure.
that's like seconds ago.
This,
And I think we as historians are like 15 years ago is really not that long in the grand scheme of things. But you're right. To the people who are using technologies 15 years ago, the memes looked completely different. They probably weren't as sophisticated politically or structurally
mm-hmm.
as they are today, if we can even call them sophisticated, which I would. But yeah, it's just again, it's a matter of perspective. There's always going to be people who take this technology seriously, who accept it, and other folks who are like, well, let's pump the brakes and not necessarily just adopt it without some critical analysis of what's actually going on here.
Well, earlier you used the word authority as in talking about authors, but I think authority as well, in the sense of who has the authority over to judge history. Is it people in the academy who refuse to adapt to new technology, or is it the people who are actually out there
Mm-hmm.
doing this shit posting, creating all this content, and getting discussion started? And that also brings up the question of, like Niels, getting back to what you said.
Yeah.
Do memes actually need to be serious, or can they just be a kind of a fun jumping off point for a really serious discussion, which I think is the case with Sherman posting.
I think it's a little column A and a little bit of column B, right? Like the memes are just sort of inseparable from humor to me, right? Like if you're not making somebody laugh, if you're not trying to create humor, then why are you using a meme? Why wouldn't you just tweet something out, right? Um, and of course, some people are always going to be dismissive of humor, but I think there's always a place for it in society. I think humor always reveals a deeper impulse. I always have to go back to one of the TV shows I watched when I was growing up, MASH. It's Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. Yeah, I don't need to explain it to you guys, but
Nope. No, you
for
don't.
people, yeah, but for people who might not know, it's about a medical unit in the Korean War, American soldiers, particularly doctors, trying to, you know, alleviate people's suffering in the midst of this carnage. And one of the main themes of the show is that the main character, Hawkeye, and his straight man, Trapper, and then later BJ, joke about everything. They don't take anything seriously. They could be in the OR like elbow deep in some guy's intestines and they're still whistling past the gallows using this black humor to confront the fact that, oh, there could be cannonballs dropped on us at any time, so let's make a PG-13 or R-rated joke. And some of these characters on MASH will repeatedly come out and say, this is our way of coping with the stress, the trauma, the horrors of this conflict is through humor, which is to say that humor can serve a deeper function than simply making people laugh. It is a very revealing psychological impulse that is shared across humanity. And I think we see that with memes as well. Yeah, the original purpose is to entertain people, maybe get a deep belly laugh out of them, but then to get them to think afterwards and be like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, well, that's interesting. I may not have taken this seriously if it didn't make me laugh at first, and then I paid greater attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's value in the humor that we see coming out of memes.
Well, is there? Do you think? I'm just thinking about the general tendency of a trend, not tendency, the general trends of memes that I see come across my different feeds. And you're talking about humor. Most of it's really dark humor. And I was thinking, my work is generally on Civil War era as well, and so thinking of Thomas Nast. And right now I'm reading "Dangerous Stir" by Mark Olgren Summers, and rereading it, and he's got a lot of Thomas Nast's drawings from Andrew Johnson's administration, and they are really, really dark. And I think there's definitely humor to them, but it's not ha humor. It's oh shit humor.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's always an element of provocatoriness, right? And that really carries through, I think, rather nicely to a lot of our memes that they're meant to shock you so much that you have to pay attention. So it's almost a tactic to like get people to stop what they're doing and fully engage with this content. So that's what my read on it is psychologically. And you see a little bit of that on Sherman posting, but it's kind of unavoidable in a topic where, over 500,000 people died in this conflict over the fundamental nature of the human character of freedom and slavery. So I mean,
it's tragic.
Yeah, the gallows humor is just sort of cooked in.
Well, and you have it at the time, you have it still today, right? So that's just the nature of how do you cope with so much loss that just it's hard to kind of imagine. I did want to pivot it so a little bit further because like we kind of established like from certain perspectives, memes being around for 10 or 15 years is short or long, whatever it is. Is there a Sherman posting on TikTok? Because that seems to be the new thing that a lot of people go to, like, oh, let me make this 2-minute video or 30-second video and grab people's attention. And it seems that would be an interesting medium as well to kind of take some meme into a video format.
It would. When I consider memes, I'm very much trying to restrict myself to still images because if you go to videos, then that opens up TikTok, it opens up YouTube and Instagram, and there's fascinating sources there, but I'm trying to like limit myself in terms of what I'm looking at right now. But you're right, TikTok is the hot thing of the minute. I mean, if you look at downloads since 2020, it outpaces every other social medium by ridiculous intervals, by a ridiculous amount. And there is pro Sherman content on there. And sometimes you'll actually see TikTok videos reposted to Reddit or reposted to Instagram or Facebook or any other social media site. So there is an interoperability here, right? That just because something originates on Twitter doesn't mean that it's not going to make its way over to Instagram or Reddit eventually. So that
Well,
I want to be, I don't want to call the divisions between social media arbitrary or indistinct because they are, but there are ways to surmount them and sort of create communities across them as well.
Well, I was going to say that there are historians who do a lot of TikTok videos, that are 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 2 minutes, as you're saying.
Yeah.
So there might be a way to translate that into what Niels you were saying about memes. Yeah, and the divisions. I mean, you see the divisions, kind of the barriers drop when you're. I have Facebook, of course. You get the reels on there, and you get things in from TikTok, and you get things in from Instagram as well. But that's pretty much it. You don't get much more. You don't get Reddit, subreddits. You don't get memes from Twitter X. You don't get yeah.
Exactly. They sort of transcend authority in that way. It doesn't really matter who created them or where they put them. What matters is how they spread. What matters is what people take away from them and how they put them here. So that interpretive component of what we do with memes and how we take them out into the world, that's what matters.
All right, now we're getting into towards hour and a half slowly. We probably should get towards the end.
Okay.
Of course, I have the feelings that after 20 minutes, a lot of people unfortunately will switch off unless they're in the gym like Andy and listening to it. But
it's mainly in the car. I have to admit, it's mainly in the car.
Well, I know a few people who listen to us on the car. So if you listen to us in the car right now, we know you're listening to us in the car right now.
Thank you.
But I was going to ask this broader kind of educational question because I think so many of us, and I would consider myself, but Andy, you probably are as well, we're very traditionally trained that we took our Civil War history class, we took our modern America class, we took the reading seminar in American history, and maybe we took like an introduction to public history, kind of a broad overview. Like I went back and got a certificate in public history, but most of us don't really encounter public history. But instead get forced into like, oh, you have to learn French and Spanish, or you have to learn like these two languages to kind of satisfy some foreign language requirement. Wouldn't it make much more sense, like from the undergrad up to the graduate degree, to make students take two at least introduction classes to public history, not just in sort of like, this is a methodology, but this is how you produce stuff, like produce memes, post memes, do TikTok videos. How do you reach an audience? What is an audience interested in? Because like, I mean, let's face it, like I literally just got a email from LSU Press that my first book sold like, I think it was about 202 copies. Like that's not a big number that I reached of people reading my book. But I can post a video and I can reach thousands of people. So the impact of these items is so much higher. So shouldn't we ask or think in graduate education, but undergraduate education as well, of like, we need to do more of this?
Absolutely. I'm lucky enough in my position at Laverne where I'm the archivist and an associate professor of history that I can sort of like bring the archives into the classroom. So I have my students digitize stuff. I'm having them sort of create portfolios of historical content that they share in classroom space. And I think that's a form of public history, right? Like they have to curate this content and then be able to share it with an audience in the classroom and online as well. I have students create entire digital collections that are available on our outward facing portal. So
Mhm.
I I really think it's important to have this exposure to public history. Ideally, you teach a few public history classes at your university, and maybe you work it into some of your other classes as well. Like I know our theory and methods classes at the University of Laverne deal with public history, with monuments, memorials, archives.
Yeah.
But in terms of how we deal with memes and that sort of content, there's definitely room to think about it more creatively moving forward. I think we need to be responding to the present times, as you said, and like
Yeah.
thinking, how do we use TikTok or Instagram to reach larger audiences than those
Mhm.
who are just reading academic monographs? And how do we tailor that content so that public audiences find it interesting and engaging?
Okay, so now I never had any public history classes. Where I did my undergrad in Indianapolis, there was a public history master's program, but I did my master's in French history elsewhere. So the public history I never had. Um, and so Niels, you're talking about having undergrad students having one or two taking one or two classes on public history. Would it have to be history, or could it be instead media literacy or something run by
Yeah.
say library sciences?
Well, I
Um,
mean, you could also think in terms of like co-teaching, right? I mean, like the
mm,
class that I still remember vividly and love was the class in okay, let me rephrase that. It's a class I really towards the end enjoyed a lot. I did not enjoy the first half, was historiography in my master's program. Like good God, Herodotus, Vita, and all these like Foucault. Oh, good God. Painful going through that. But in the last 5 weeks, I think was 5 weeks, 4 weeks or 5 weeks, the professor brought in professors from the department, was like, what do you do? What is the conversation historiographical in your field? And it was amazing just to kind of see these conversations happening, right? And I think that would be the great thing if you kind of, it would be very difficult to implement, but it would be great to kind of be like, you over there in computer science or IT or whatever your department is, you know how to design a website, you know how to video edit. Come on in. 2 weeks, you can have a little time in my classroom. You're in the library, archives. How do you deal with archives? How do you do like um document preservation, like, like bring somebody from the local historical community society and then, like, what's the conversation you have right now? Like, I think that would be the fun, because that gives these different voices, gives the experts that actually do this on a daily basis the ability, and you can always afterwards kind of debrief and be like we had one time this guy from Historic Macon give a talk on campus, and like I sat there in the background, was like, he's talking beep gender gentrification and the ousting of African Americans from like their place in the community. And no one asks the question. No one really critically engaged that, right? Like afterwards, we had like tons of conversations at home about it. But like that's those moments. Like you let them talk, but then you can debrief afterwards with the students and be like, okay, you heard this. That's one way to think about it. There's another way to think about this, right? But I think that would be the brilliance, kind of like, yeah, students have to take a historic methods class. Why not take also one in public history or public engagement and be like, here's all these different ways how to do it.
Public engagement. That's I think that's more what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, because digital humanities is certainly a huge part of that. But I think there are other methods that we need to be aware of as well, whether that's public speaking, whether that's designing
Yeah.
research projects that appeal to public audiences rather than
Mhm.
manuscripts for other scholars, which certainly have a place in the field. But, if we're not reaching a broader audience than that, then I have to question whether what we're doing is worthwhile. But maybe that's putting it a little bit too harshly, but I have to think that we're reaching an audience of more than just a few hundred people. I've gotten those book reports back as well, Niels, where it's just like, oh,
Yeah.
a few dozen people have bought your book over the last few months, and it's like that's
Yeah.
great, but more of them have like read the Throwback Thursday posts that I put on the archives page for Instagram that I run. So
Yeah. Yeah.
different stuff.
Exactly, right? Like I mean, I enjoyed writing the book, but you kind of afterwards do raise this sort of question of like, 200 people. I spent way more than 200 hours writing this thing, right? Is
Well,
that
but to be fair, some of those copies ended up at libraries, so more
true?
than one person will read them in each case, and they'll get ordered through into a library loan. So they might
Right.
end up crossing state lines, going
Yeah.
different places. So it's not all is lost. And then of course you have the ebook as well, right? Where
Yeah.
I don't
No,
I don't
that
know
was
if the
included actually.
that wasn't okay.
Like I think there was 19 copies that were ebook sold.
Well, it's interesting to know that we're still very much in a hard copy world then, that people
Yeah.
prefer to have the book in front of them rather than on Kindle or whatever device they're using to read.
That was a debate that I was having, or debate. It was a conversation I was having with one of my friends on Blue Sky the other day. Differences between it's great to have an audiobook, but it's even better to have the physical copy of the book. So
Hmm.
yeah, you might use your Audible credit to listen to a book, but you're still going to buy a physical copy anyway,
Right.
Exactly.
which
Yeah.
you can see I have not enough of course.
There's
Well, okay,
never enough.
so then we talked about this earlier, but and I don't know how long, Niels, you want to talk, and Ben, you want to talk, but um
A little bit
uh
more.
a little bit more. So you're talking about in the academy, writing for the academy, writing with university presses, peer-reviewed books, and then earlier we talked about popular historians as well, or popular history, writing for a much broader audience, a much more general audience. So somewhere in there, maybe bridging the gap again between the meme world, the world of Web 2.0, and published history, whether it be the academy or more general popular history. There seems like there's got to be there's got to be room for all of that and to come together, to blend together, and something new to come out of it, to produce something new.
I think so too. And I think it's a little bit of columns A, B, and C, right? I think it is maintaining our traditional scholarship, but then maybe giving book talks or doing public lectures, putting stuff on TikTok or Instagram, whether that's their own accounts or through departments of history or departments of libraries that we work at. I think we have to realize that no one method is going to reach every audience, right? So we have to sort of be multimodal in terms of how we engage people, part digital, part in person, part, traditional publishing. So I think if we have a foot in each one of those worlds, which is 3 feet, and most people don't have 3 feet, then we're able to sort of have the best of all the different worlds at our fingertips.
No, I think that's a good point, right? We want to reach the public. Like that's like my first two books, I didn't really think about it. My third book was supposed to reach the public, and it of course happened during COVID.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like, I wanted to go out and give talks. I kind of desperately sought out these opportunities, and then
that's the Macon book, right?
Yeah, that's the Macon book, and you kind of like reach out to all these people, and like, no, we don't do this currently, and blah blah blah, and like, but yet that's exactly like the point, right? Of like call in favors and be like, I'm now having the new book coming out in April. I'm kind of, maybe somebody actually listens to this point still, that I'm kind of like, I have interviewed over 100 people. Like I would like at least 10% of that maybe to invite me for a talk in some form, which would be nice. But you never know. But that's sort of like, don't just go to the universities, right? Go to these public institutions, like go to the libraries, museums, the national parks. Like I told my co-author, like, if we get a talk in like Atlanta, let's reach out to like Chattanooga and Andersonville and like Kennesaw Mountain and be like, hey, we're in the area. You want us to come up? We'll do it for free. Like it's a national park service. They're cash strapped like all of us. But it gets us maybe 5 more extra books sold.
Well, and then not to mention podcasts.
Right. Yeah.
My main source, besides say Twitter, is podcasts.
Right.
And
here we are.
Here we are. That's exactly right. I don't know how many books I've bought because I've heard authors on podcasts recommend it, or in talking about their books or talking about other things. And I mean, I ordered 2 last night from Amazon from podcasts that I listened to this week. So
one of them, of course, was The Octopus Garden. Sorry, that one is not out yet.
Okay.
But I think we should call it, for the 2 Europeans here, a night, for Ben a day, so he can actually do some stuff if he needs to still go grocery shopping or something here on Saturday. But it was great. Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, is it 11 or is it 10 o'clock?
Yeah, so most of the day, mass majority of the day still ahead of me.
Okay.
Yes, 11, like I was saying, right? So you're gonna we get our time change this week, so you already had that
tonight.
That's right, exactly. Well, I hope you can adjust to it. Are you guys springing forward too?
Yep. I think my son will be very happy. Get an hour extra sleep.
Yeah.
Well, good for him. Good attitude.
Good for all that.
Yeah, good for us. Well, again, thank you so much, Ben, for rejoining us and to talk about this like broad-ranging material with regard to digital history, Sherman, Reddit, and so on. That was very enlightening and amazing to talk about. Also, thank you for Andy to join us as co-host today. Yeah, co-host. You're co-host today. So with that, thank you for listening. If you're interested in Ben's article, it's on the Public Historians' website journal, published this February. And let me just real quick give the title again: Recasting Uncle Billy